Hi, it's Saturday, December 12th, 2015. Just reading an article in the dailymail.co.uk newspaper in the UK. It says, down to the wire, delegates at Paris Climate Conference finally agree draft which would force countries to limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius. Apparently these delegates from 190 countries or 190 officials from around the world have been negotiating for 2 weeks to come to an agreement. It says China, India, Malaysia, and Saudi Arabia previously opposed many points, but it seems like now they've agreed to it. Well, I'd like to talk about who's really behind this climate change or global warming industry, because that's, in my opinion, what it is. In 1992, George Hunt made a very interesting video about the Earth Summit in Rio. It was a UN Earth Summit organized by UNCED, which is an acronym in the UN for the UN. It's United Nations Climate and Environment Development Commission. George Hunt, he was a businessman who was involved in an environment industry, and in his video, which I will put below as a link to this video, and I recommend everyone should look at that if you're interested in knowing who's really behind climate change industry. So basically the gist of it is he goes on to explain, because he's an insider, so he's kind of a whistleblower, and this was in 1992, his video. He basically said that the environmental movement started out in the early 70s, and by the main drivers behind it were the Rothschild and Rockefeller trusts, and they employed a person called Maurice Strong, who is considered the father of environmental issues. He died, I think, a week or two ago. I think he was in his 80s, Maurice Strong, and he was UN commissioner for UNCED for many years. So what George Hunt says is that he was in many of these caucuses or meeting about the environment, because he really believed, that something should be done. He ran a small business as well, environment business. And in 1987, he said he went to an important Congress. It was called the Fourth World Congress in Denver, Colorado. And he was surprised, to see people like David Rockefeller there. He saw also the Secretary of the Treasury at the time, James Baker, was there. And most important of all, Baron Edmund de Rothschild was there. And he basically goes on to explain how Maurice Strong, who was at this summit, praised Baron de Rothschild and said that he was the driving force behind environmentalism. Not Maurice Strong, but it was Baron de Rothschild. And George Hunt goes on to explain that fourth world to these people actually meant, what the world would become like, the one world globalist government. It would be called the fourth world. And the reason why it's the fourth world is because you have the first world, which is the developed countries. You have the second world, which at the time was the Soviet bloc. You have the third world, which were the poor developing nations of Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia. And then you have the fourth world, which would be the bringing together of, the whole world into one global government kind of scenario. At the time, they told George Hunt that It just meant that it was the fourth summit they're having, but it was the Fourth World Congress meeting. And the idea behind the Fourth World is basically globalization. And George Hunt goes on to explain that the reason why they wanted to, develop this theme or this industry of climate change or environmentalism is to have the first world be brought down in terms of, how can I say, living standards down to more towards a third world, kind of situation, so they could, control the whole world. They didn't want like nations to be powerful and economically independent. So by having global warming or climate change or environmentalism, they would force through UN dictats, they would force, global rules on each individual nation. And that's what's happening now. George Hunt was saying this in 1992. He knew what was going to happen, and it's taken a long time, but it's happened. The other thing he points out is that all the ideas and the decisions that came about in the Earth Summit in 1992, the UN Earth Summit, all the ideas about climate change, global warming, environmentalism were proposed by Baron Edmund de Rothschild. And according to George Hunt, who was involved in all these, summits and meetings, there was no discussion. And the UN took all the instructions from Baron de Rothschild. George Hunt goes on to say in his video that he tried to question some of the things that were said by Baron de Rothschild at the meeting, because he was there, and apparently he was blocked from doing it. They didn't allow him to question Baron de Rothschild. And of course, the Rockefellers were there as well, David Rockefeller. So they're both trusts were involved, Rockefeller and Rothschild trusts. They're the ones behind the global warming and climate change industry. The other interesting thing he goes on to say is that Maurice Strong gave an interview to a magazine, which you'll be able to see in the video, and basically says the burning question at the time, back in the early 90s, was whether the developed countries or the first world would accept these new global rules dictated by the UN and indirectly by Edmund de Rothschild. And he said if they didn't, they would just like indebt the whole world and then bring it down economically. And once you bring the first world to its knees economically, then it would be easier to impose all these globalist climate change rules, where, all the rules on, carbon emissions, that's all limiting people's, ability to live and to, produce things. So it's interesting that George Hunt said that in 1992, that if the people, the globalists in charge of pushing this climate change, global warming agenda, they said that if they weren't able to do it through, voluntary means, i.e. these countries would agree to it, they would just basically goose up the global economy with huge amount of debt, and then pull the plug and implode the global economy. And under such crisis scenario, it would be a lot easier to install this global government through the guise of climate change. I'm not making any of this up. Listen to this video by George Hunt. It's back in 1992, so he knew what was going on, and it's only 36 minutes. Basically, he would just explain what I've said in much more detail. I just thought I'd do something short and summarize what he said, and I felt it was the right time to do it as well with what's been going on in Paris, and hopefully, we won't see this global government come to power, but they have a lot of influence, and power still. So I'm not I'm not too optimistic about it, but you never know. Take care. Have a good weekend. Bye bye.